The armor was not the lesson. The lesson was the will it represented. The lesson was the chilling fact that deep within humanity was a capacity for focused, resilient, and personal violence that the logical, clean warfare galaxy could not comprehend. Tay finished wiping his face. He walked over to Jin and looked down at the armor. He placed a hand on the breastplate, right over a deep plasma scar. It held, Tay said simply. It held, Jin agreed. That was all that needed to be said. Director Kale finally turned and walked slowly out of the bay. He did not look back. The other officials followed him, their heads bowed, their usual confident chatter completely silent. The news spread across the Nexus station. The story of the human armor was told and retold. It was not told as a story of a primitive tool. It was told as a story of a waking giant, a reminder of a species that had forged its way to the stars not through peaceful means, but through an endless, brutal struggle against itself, a species that had looked into the abyss of its own soul for thousands of years, and had learned how to build a shell to survive it. The shiny, fabricated armor was eventually put in a museum display, with a small sign explaining its origin. The real armor, the one covered in hammer marks and plasma scars, was kept by the humans. They did not put it on display. They did not show it off. They treated it with a quiet, solemn respect. It was not a trophy. It was a warning, a reminder of a darkness they had overcome, but a darkness that was always a part of them. The task had been completed. The Galactic Union had learned what it had asked to learn. They had learned that humanity's ancient armor was not just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of a terrifying and profound truth, that the most dangerous enemy a human would ever face was another human, and that to survive that, they had learned to become for a time something less than human and something more. They had learned to become unbreakable. From the deep shadows behind the armor, a figure emerged. It was Tay. He had not left. He had stayed, feeling that his duty was not yet complete. He had been standing in the darkness, as still as the armor itself, watching and waiting. He moved without a sound. He stepped up to the wooden form holding the dark armor. In one smooth, practiced motion, he picked up the helmet and placed it over his head. The hollow thump of it settling into place made the Cathar warriors turn. They saw a human putting on an old helmet. The lead warrior snarled. Another human? In a metal costume? This is not a performance. He swung his plasma caster away from Kale and toward Tay. He fired. A bolt of superheated green plasma shot across the room. It struck Tay square on the left shoulder plate. There was a sizzling crackle of energy. The smell of burnt metal filled the air. A black scorched scar was burned into the dark gray steel. But the plasma did not melt through. It did not penetrate. The hardened, hammered steel, designed to stop crossbow bolts at point-blank range, had dissipated the energy. The armor held. The Cathar warrior stared, his jaw slightly slack. His weapon was supposed to melt through modern combat armor. This primitive metal shell should be a puddle on the floor. Tay did not stagger. He did not cry out. He simply looked down at the scorch mark on his shoulder, then back at the Cathar. The dark eye slit gave no emotion. He took a step forward. The sound of his steel-shod foot on the floor was like a hammer strike. The Cathar fired again. Another bolt. It hit the breastplate. Another black scar. Another step forward from Tay. He was not running. He was walking. A slow, deliberate, unstoppable advance, just as Jin had described. He was walking through the storm. Panic began to touch the Cathar. They all opened fire. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air, striking his legs, his arms, his chest. Scorch marks appeared all over the dark armor, but the man inside was untouched. The air filled with the acrid smoke of burnt paint and metal. Tay was upon them. The lead warrior, now terrified, switched his grip on his plasma caster, swinging it like a club. Tay's gauntleted hand shot out. He caught the weapon's barrel mid-swing. There was a screech of metal as his steel fingers crushed it. He ripped the weapon from the warrior's grasp and threw it aside. The Cathar stared at his empty hands. Then he looked up into the dark, faceless helm. Tay did not use a weapon. He was the weapon. He drove his armored fist forward. It was not a punch. It was a battering ram. The steel vambrace connected with the Cathar's jaw. There was a sickening, wet crack. The warrior crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The second Cathar lunged with an energy blade. The glowing blade sliced through the air. Tay moved his arm to block. The blade screeched against the steel gauntlet. sending out sparks, but it could not cut through. Before the warrior could react, Tay grabbed his weapon arm and twisted. The sound of breaking bone was loud and clear. The warrior screamed. Tay shoved him hard, sending him crashing into the wall where he slid down motionless. The third and fourth warriors attacked together. One fired his rifle at point-blank range. The bolt seared into Tay's cloak, setting it on fire at the edge. But the armor beneath was unharmed. The other tried to tackle him. It was like tackling a statue. Tay did not move. He turned, grabbed the warrior who had tackled him by the neck of his armor and lifted him off the ground. With a powerful heave, he threw the warrior into the last one standing. They both fell in a tangled heap. Tay took 2 heavy steps and brought his foot down on the rifle of one, shattering it. He then struck the other on the head with his closed fist. The sound was a dull final gong. Both lay still. The entire fight had taken less than 15 seconds. Silence returned to the bay, deeper and more profound than before. The only sounds were the crackle of the smoldering cloak and Tay's own breathing, a low rhythmic sound from inside the helmet. He stood amidst the 4 fallen Cathar, a dark, faceless giant in a room of fallen enemies. The scorch marks on his armor were like badges of honor. He turned his helmet slowly, the eye slit scanning the room, checking for more threats. There were none. He then looked at Jin, Mira, and Director Kale. They were unharmed. They were safe. Slowly, Tay reached up with both hands. He found the latches of the helmet. There was a hiss of equalizing pressure. He lifted the helmet from his head. The face that was revealed was the same calm face from before. There was no rage, no excitement, just a slight sheen of sweat and the steady breath of a man who had done a difficult job. His eyes met Jin's and he gave a single, small nod. It was done. The armor had been tested, not in a demonstration, but in battle. The silence in the workshop bay was heavy and thick. It was broken only by the faint crackle of the smoldering edge of Tay's black cloak, and the low, steady sound of his breathing. The smell of burnt metal, ozone, and something coppery filled the hot air. The 4 Cathar warriors lay in broken heaps on the floor. One groaned softly but did not move. The others were still. The shiny fabricated armor in the corner stood untouched, a silent witness to the brutal efficiency of its darker twin. Director Kale stood frozen. His large dark eyes were fixed on Tay. He watched as the soldier calmly unbuckled the gauntlets from his hands. He watched as Tay lifted the heavy breastplate over his head. Each piece of armor was placed on the workbench with a solid, heavy clank. The sounds were loud in the quiet room. Kyle's mind, a place of pure logic and data, was struggling. It was trying to process what his eyes had just seen. He had watched energy weapons powerful enough to disable a vehicle strike that suit of armor. He had seen them leave nothing but black scars. He had watched a single man, without firing a single shot, dismantle 4 elite Cathar raiders with his bare, metal-covered hands. It was not a battle. It was a demolition. His eyes moved from Tay to the armor on the bench. The dull hammer-marked steel was now decorated with the black burns of plasma fire. It looked even more fearsome than before. It looked used. It looked proven. Station security teams finally arrived, their boots stomping in the corridor. They rushed in, their own sleek armor and energy rifles looking out of place. They saw the fallen Cathar and quickly moved to secure them. The lead security officer stared in shock at the scene. Jin and Mira stood together. Mira let out a slow, shaky breath. Jin's face was pale, but his eyes were clear. He walked over to the armor on the bench. He did not look at the scorch marks with pride. He looked at them with a deep old sadness. He ran his fingers over a burn on the shoulder plate. Tay, now out of the heavy gambeson, stood in his simple clothes. He picked up a cloth and began silently wiping the sweat from his face and neck. He did not look at the Cathar. He did not seem to notice the security teams. He had done his job. The rest was not his concern. Director Kale finally found his voice. It was quiet and it wavered. He was not speaking to the room. He was speaking to Jin, his question a whisper of pure, uncomprehending horror. "Your ancient wars," Kale began, his eyes wide and fixed on the helmet with its narrow, dark slit. "What kind of enemy? What kind of monsters were you fighting, that you needed to become this?" He gestured a trembling hand towards the armor. "To walk through fire. To feel blows that could break stone on your body and not fall. To become a thing that breaks other living things with its hands. What enemy could possibly require such a horror?" Jen looked up from the armor. He looked at Director Kyle. He saw the fear in the alien's eyes. Not fear of the Cathar, not fear of the weapons. It was a deeper fear, the fear of finally understanding a terrible truth. Jin's voice was soft, but it cut through the air like a knife. It was the simplest and most devastating answer he could give. "Director," Jin said, "we weren't fighting aliens." He let the words hang in the smoky air for a moment, allowing their full weight to settle. "We were fighting each other." The truth landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. Director Kyle took a step back as if he had been pushed. His logical mind, which could understand war as a conflict between different species, different worlds, different ideologies, could not grasp this. To create such a terrible, personal, intimate instrument of war, for use against your own kind, to look at another human being, and to build a shell that allowed you to walk up to them and end their life face to face. It was monstrous. It was unthinkable. The security teams had stopped their work. They were listening. They looked at the dark, scarred armor with new, awestruck eyes. The task had been to recreate ancient armor. They had done that. But the human had returned from a battle, and in doing so, he had not just shown them a piece of history. He had held up a mirror to the very soul of humanity. They had shown the galaxy that humanity's past was not just one of simple tools and primitive struggles. It was a past drenched in a specific, personal kind of violence, a violence that required not just strength but an unimaginable will. The will to put on a metal shell to shut out the world, to reduce your existence to a narrow slit of light and the sound of your own breath, and to march forward into a storm of arrows, and later, into a storm of bullets and explosions, all to confront someone who was, in the end, just like you. Then the arms. The shoulder plates, the upper arm defenses, the lower arm guards, and finally the gauntlets. The gauntlets were complex, made of many small plates that allowed his fingers to move. He flexed his hands, making fists and then opening them. The metal fingers moved with a soft scraping sound. He was almost complete. The only thing missing was the head. Director Kale watched, his expression unreadable. "The weight appears to be significant. Can he move effectively?" As if in answer, Tay began to walk. He did not shuffle. His steps were firm and deliberate. He turned. He knelt down on one knee, the metal of his knee plate hitting the floor with a loud clack. He stood up again smoothly. He moved with a powerful, controlled grace. The armor did not seem to restrict him. It seemed to become part of him. It moved with him. "The articulation is sufficient," Kale noted, speaking to an aide, "but the visual limitation of the helmet remains a severe tactical disadvantage." Now it was time for the helmet. Jin picked it up. It was the most intimidating piece. A full helmet of steel, shaped to the head, with that single dark slit for vision. Jin held it out to Tay. Tay took it. He held the helmet in his gauntleted hands. He looked into the empty eye slit for a long moment. Then, without ceremony, he placed it over his head and pushed it down. It settled into place with a soft, hollow sound. The change was instant and total. The man named Tay disappeared. The person who stood before them was no longer a soldier from the modern era. He was something else, something ancient and grim. The dark, formless metal head with its narrow line for a stare was terrifying. It gave no emotion. It showed no fear, no anger, no humanity. It was a mask of pure purpose. The being in the armor stood perfectly still. The black cloak hung straight down. Not a single piece of metal rattled. The silence in the room was heavy. Director Kale felt a strange feeling. It was a coldness in his blood. He was looking at a machine, but he knew a man was inside. The disconnect was unsettling. "Can he hear us?" Kale asked, his voice sounding oddly loud. "He can hear you," Jin said. "The helmet does not block sound. It focuses it. The only things he hears are the sounds from outside and the sound of his own breathing. Ask him to demonstrate the range of vision," Kyle said. Jin looked at the armored figure. "Tay, what can you see?" A voice came from inside the helmet. It was Tay's voice, but it was changed. It was deeper, echoed slightly in the metal shell, and was completely flat. "I see a strip of the world. I see you. I see the director. I see the wall behind you. I do not see what is beside me. I do not see what is above or below. The world is a hallway, a tunnel. This is an unacceptable field of view for modern combat," one of the other officials whispered to Kale. But Kale was not so sure. He remembered Jin's words. It is to reduce the world to a narrow slit, to focus the wearer solely on the task ahead. Looking at the faceless metal form, he began to understand. This was not for seeing the whole battlefield. This was for seeing only the enemy in front of you. Everything else was a distraction. It was a psychological tool of immense power. The helmet's purpose is isolation, Jin repeated quietly, as if reading Kale's thoughts. It separates the man inside from the world outside. It separates him from his own humanity. He is no longer Tay. He is the armor. His own breathing is the only thing that reminds him he is still a man. The armored figure took a step forward, then another. Its movements were slow, heavy, and incredibly deliberate. It did not seem to walk so much as it advanced. It stopped a few feet from Director Kale. The dark eye slit seemed to be looking right through him. Kale, a being who had negotiated with warlords and stared down rebel fleets, felt a primal urge to step back. He did not. But the feeling was there. This was fear. Not the fear of a weapon that could destroy a city, but the fear of a thing that could walk up to you without hurry and not stop. The demonstration is sufficient, Kale said, his voice tighter than usual. The armor's mobility and psychological impact are noted. He turned and led the other officials out of the bay quickly. The door hissed shut behind them, leaving the humans alone with the silent armored figure. Jin walked up to it. You can take it off now, Tay. For a moment, the figure did not move. Then gauntleted hands rose up, found the seals, and lifted the helmet. The sound of it breaking its seal was a gasp of air. Tay's face was revealed. It was calm, but there was a sheen of sweat on his brow. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had been in a very dark, very quiet place. He looked at Jin. It is heavy, Tay said. His real voice sounded strange after the helmet's echo. It is, Jin agreed. Not just the steel, Tay nodded. He knew what Jin meant. The weight of history. The weight of purpose. The weight of becoming something other than yourself. The armor was complete. It had been built. It had been worn. It had been seen. But as Jin looked at the helmet in Tai's hands, he knew the true test had not yet come. The Union had seen the shell. They had felt a chill, but they still did not understand the storm that lived inside it. They did not understand what would happen when the armor was not just worn but used. The station was quiet. The demonstration was over. The dark suit of armor stood once more on its wooden form in the workshop bay. The only sounds were the soft movements of Jin and Mira as they cleaned their tools. Tay had left, returning to his duties. A sense of completion hung in the air. The task was done, then the lights flickered. A low vibrating hum echoed through the floor, a sound that was not part of the station's normal rhythm. Mira looked up, her eyes wide. What was that? Before Jin could answer, a piercing alarm shattered the silence. It was a harsh, blaring sound they had only ever heard in drills. Red emergency lights began to flash, painting the smoky bay in pulses of crimson. A voice, tight with panic, came over the station's speaker system. Security alert. Breach in Sector Gamma, hostile borders. All personnel shelter in place. This is not a drill, Jin and Mira froze. Hostile borders? On the Nexus? It was unthinkable. This was a place of peace and science. The door to the workshop bay hissed open. Director Kale stood there, his usual calm replaced by a stiff urgency. There is no time. A Cathar raiding party has broken through. They are heading for the central labs. They must be after the research. The Cathar. Everyone in the galaxy knew of them. A violent reptilian species. They were raiders, conquerors. They valued strength above all else. We must evacuate you to a safe room, Kale said, gesturing for them to follow. But it was too late. From down the corridor came the sound of energy fire, the high-pitched whine of plasma casters. They heard shouts, then screams, and then a terrible silence. Heavy, thudding footsteps approached. They were not the soft steps of station security. They were the clomping, aggressive steps of armored warriors. Director Kale backed into the bay, his large eyes wide with a fear he had probably never felt before. They are here, he whispered. The door was blasted open. The metal frame glowed red-hot and bent inward. 4 Cathar warriors filled the doorway. They were tall, with scaled green skin and yellow slitted eyes. They wore sharp, angular armor of black and red. The lead warrior held a large plasma caster, its barrel still smoking from blowing open the door. The others held glowing energy blades and heavy rifles. They stepped into the bay, their eyes scanning the room. They saw the director. They saw the 2 humans. And then they saw the suits of armor. The lead Cathar let out a guttural laugh, a sound like rocks grinding together. He pointed a clawed finger at the shiny fabricated armor in the corner. Look, the humans make toys. Pretty metal for their walls. His soldiers laughed with him. They did not even glance at the dark, hammer-marked suit. They saw the shine and thought it was decoration. The lead warrior raised his plasma caster, aiming it at Director Kale. You, Director, you will come with us. Your data will be our prize. Kale stood frozen, his logical mind offering no solution to this brutal direct threat. Jin and Mira were trapped against the workbench. There was nowhere to run. The Cathar were between them and the only exit. Jin's eyes darted around the room, looking for anything, any tool he could use as a weapon. He saw only hammers and tongs, useless against plasma. The lead Cathar's finger tightened on the trigger. In that moment, Jin's eyes met Mira's. A silent, desperate understanding passed between them. There was one thing in the room that was not a tool. It was a weapon. Jin looked past the Cathar to the dark corner where the real armor stood. He made a sharp slashing motion with his hand, a signal he had hoped never to use. The Galactic Union's research station, known as the Nexus, was a place of quiet sounds and clean lines. The air always smelled the same. The light was always perfectly bright. It was a place for thinking, for data, for understanding the universe in a calm and logical way. One of the Union's great projects was called the Historical Armament Initiative. The idea was simple. Every species in the Union would look back into its own deep past. They would find a great weapon or armor from their ancient history, from the time before they traveled between stars. Then they would rebuild it. The goal was not to make new weapons for war. The goal was to learn. The Union wanted to understand the warrior spirit of each species. What did they value in a fight? How did they think about protection and attack? When it was humanity's turn, the Union directors expected many things. They expected a team of soldiers. They expected loud voices and big ideas. They expected to see plans for a powerful energy gun or a complex shield. What they got was Jin and Mira. Jin was a man who looked more comfortable in a dusty library than a shiny lab. He was quiet. His eyes seemed to be looking at things from a long time ago. He was a historian, an expert in the way things were made centuries back on Earth. Mira was an archaeologist. Her job was to dig up old things and understand them. She was sharper than Jin, faster to speak. She was there to make sure the Union directors understood the truth of what they were seeing. They stood in a large circular room. The floor was a smooth white material. In the center of the room was a large holographic table. On the other side of the table stood Director Kale. Director Kale was not human. He was tall and very thin. His skin was a pale gray color. His face had large dark eyes that did not blink often. He had no hair. He was a being of pure logic and calm thought. He represented the Union on this project. Your submission has been received, Director Kale said. His voice was smooth like a computer speaking, but it was his real voice. The data is unusual. He pressed a button on the table. A three-dimensional image appeared in the air above it. It was a human form, dressed in a suit of armor. It was not sleek or shiny. It was made of many pieces of hard gray steel. It had broad shoulders. It had plates covering the chest, the arms, the legs. The helmet was the most frightening part. It was a full helmet that covered the entire head. The front was a single piece of metal with a narrow slit for the eyes. It looked heavy. It looked old. This is your species' choice, Director Kale asked. This Gothic plate armor? Yes, Mira said. Her voice was clear and firm. This was one of the highest forms of personal protection developed on Earth before the age of gunpowder changed everything. Director Kyle tilted his head. He zoomed in on the armor on the hologram. He pointed a long, thin finger. I have reviewed the materials, he said. Iron and steel, carbon-based polymers for the underlayer. The defensive properties are minimal. A standard infantry energy pistol would melt through this chest plate in less than a second. The mobility is also poor. A wearer could not run quickly. They could not climb well. The visual range from the helmet is severely restricted. Please explain the strategic value. Why did your people create this? Jin looked up from the floor. He had been quiet until now. He spoke softly, but his words were careful and strong. Director, Jin said, you are looking at it as a piece of technology. You are comparing it to your energy shields and your alloy plating. That is the wrong way to see it. He stepped closer to the hologram. He looked at the suit of armor with a kind of sadness and respect. "This armor is not just a tool," Jin continued. "It is a statement. On the battlefields of its time, the greatest dangers were not lasers. They were arrows. They were heavy bolts fired from crossbows. They were swords and axes and spears. This armor was a portable fortress. It was made for one person. It allowed a single human to walk directly into a storm of arrows. He could walk through a cloud of bolts from crossbows. He could emerge on the other side, completely unharmed. He became the unbreakable center of his group of soldiers. Where he walked, his soldiers followed. The enemy could not stop him." Mira nodded. She took over, knowing Jin did not like to talk for a long time. "You asked for a pinnacle of ancient warfare, Director," she said. "For us, for a very long time, the pinnacle was not a weapon that could kill many. It was armor that could make one man nearly unkillable. It shifted the balance of the entire battle. It was a psychological tool. Seeing a line of these men dressed in this steel walking toward you, it was a terrifying thing. It broke the enemy's spirit before the first blow was even struck." Director Kale was silent for a moment. His large dark eyes looked at the armor again. He was trying to understand. In his experience, war was about efficiency. It was about hitting from a long distance. It was about disabling systems. This idea of walking slowly toward your enemy, of being a symbol, was strange to him. It was personal. "It is an inefficient use of resources," Kyle stated. "The materials and skill required to make one suit could make many simpler armors for more soldiers." "That is true," Jin agreed. "But it was not made for common soldiers. It was made for the ones who led from the front. It was a symbol of power and wealth. It showed that the person inside was important. It was also a work of art. The blacksmith who made it was a master of his craft. He was not just making a tool. He was making a second skin for a warrior." Kyle processed this. The idea of war as art was another strange concept. But the Union's goal was to understand, not to judge. "Very well," Director Kale said finally. "The project is approved. The task for the human species is set. Recreate the ancient armor. You will have full access to the station's fabrication units and any materials you require." "Thank you, Director," Mira said. But as Kyle turned to leave, Jin spoke again. "Director," he said, "there is one more thing. The fabrication units. They will not be enough." Kale turned back. "Our fabricators can replicate any material structure with perfect accuracy. They can build a starship engine. They can certainly build this. They can build the shape," Jin said. "They can make a perfect copy. But it will be a hollow copy. It will have no soul. To truly recreate this armor, we must make it the old way. We must use a forge. We must use hammers and fire. We must work the metal with our own hands." This was a highly irregular request. The station was a clean and safe place. Fire and hammers were primitive, dirty, and dangerous. Director Kale looked at the two humans. He saw the quiet determination in Jin's eyes. He saw the firm support in Mira's posture. He decided that this was part of the learning experience. "Your request is approved," Kyle said. "You will be assigned a secure workshop bay. You may bring in the tools you need. But all safety protocols must be followed." Jin simply bowed his head slightly. As Director Kale walked away, the hologram of the armor still hung in the air. It looked dark and heavy and out of place in the bright, clean room. Mira let out a slow breath. "They don't understand, do they?" she said to Jin. Jin kept looking at the armor. "No," he replied softly. "They see a simple old tool. They do not see the man who wore it. They do not hear the sound of his breathing inside the helmet. They do not feel the weight he carried, not just the weight of the steel, the weight of being the one who has to walk forward when everyone else is running away." Together they left the room. The task was clear. They had to build the armor. But Jin knew, and Mira was starting to understand, that building the metal shell was only the first step. They had to find a way to show the Union what the armor truly meant. They had to show them the human spirit that lived inside that cold, hard steel, a spirit that could be both terribly violent and unbreakably strong. And they had to hope that the galaxy was ready to see it. The workshop bay assigned to the humans was a world apart from the rest of the Nexus station. The clean white walls were now smudged with dark handprints. The air, once sterile, was thick with the smells of coal smoke, hot metal, and old leather. The quiet hum of the station was drowned out by new sounds: the roar of fire, the clang of hammers, and the hiss of red-hot steel being plunged into oil. Jin and his small team of human artisans had turned the bay into a scene from Earth's distant past. A large brick-lined forge glowed with orange heat. An anvil, a heavy block of iron, stood firm in the center of the activity. This was their method. This was the old way. The Union's fabricators had, of course, made their version first. It stood on a display stand in the corner of the bay. It was a perfect copy of the holographic design. The metal was smooth and shiny like a mirror. Every line was straight. Every curve was perfect. It was a marvel of modern technology. And to Jin it was completely wrong. Director Kale visited on the third day. He stood at the entrance, his tall frame seeming uncomfortable in the messy, hot space. He looked at the gleaming, fabricated armor, and then at the busy, soot-covered humans. The fabricator's version is complete and meets all specified measurements, Kale said, his voice cutting through the noise. Why does this manual labor continue? Mira, who was overseeing the organization of leather straps, wiped her brow, leaving a dark streak. Director, the fabricator made a statue. We are making a tool. More than a tool, we are making a piece of a person. The shine is wrong. The perfection is wrong. Real armor was not perfect. It was lived in. It was functional. Jin did not look up from his work. He was holding a piece of chest plate and a set of heavy tongs. It was glowing a bright, fiery orange. With a smooth, practiced motion, he pulled it from the forge and laid it on the anvil. He picked up a heavy hammer. Then he began to strike. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was loud and solid. It was not the gentle tap of a machine. It was the powerful, ringing blow of a human shaping metal by force and skill. With each strike, sparks flew like orange stars around him. The metal slowly changed its shape, bending to his will. The other artisans were doing the same, each working on a different piece. A leg plate, a shoulder guard, a gauntlet for the hand. Director Kale watched, his large eyes unblinking. He saw the sweat on Jin's face. He saw the focus in his eyes. He saw the way the metal responded, not with digital precision, but with physical, brute force transformation. It was inefficient. It was chaotic. It was fascinating, the hammer marks, Kale observed. The fabricator's version has a perfectly smooth surface. Your version will have these imperfections. Does this not weaken the metal? Jin paused, the hammer held in midair. The hot metal sizzled in the cool air. It changes the metal, Jin corrected softly. It makes it stronger in some ways. But that is not the point. The marks are the signature of the smith. They are a record of the work. They show that a human being made this. For the man who wore it, it was a reminder that another person, a craftsman, put his skill and his strength into this piece to protect his life. It was a connection. He plunged the shaped metal into a large barrel of oil. It erupted in a violent hiss and a cloud of thick, acrid smoke. Director Kale took a small step back. The oil hardens the steel, Jin explained, pulling out the now blackened and hardened plate. This is called quenching. It makes the surface hard so a blade will slide off or break against it. For the next several days, the work continued. The shiny, perfect pieces from the fabricator were ignored. Instead, the bay filled with dark gray pieces of steel. They were not pretty. They looked serious. They looked like they had a purpose. Next came the underlayer. The fabricator had created a smooth, synthetic padding. Jin's team instead worked on a gambeson, a thick, padded jacket made of many layers of linen stuffed with wool. It was clumsy-looking and rough. This is necessary? Kale asked, watching one of the artisans sew the heavy cloth. It seems primitive. The armor is not worn on the skin, Mira explained. The gambeson is the first layer. It absorbs shock. If a mace hits the steel plate, the gambeson stops the force from breaking the ribs underneath. It also makes the hot metal more comfortable to wear. It is as important as the steel itself. Then came the leather. They used thick brown leather for the straps and buckles that would hold the armor together. The leather was not new and soft. It was stiff and worn-looking. They treated it with wax and smoke to give it a smell and a feel of age. Finally, they added a cloak. It was a large piece of heavy cloth dyed a deep, dark black. It had no decoration, no symbols. It was just black. After 2 weeks of this intense hands-on work, it was time to assemble the suit. They did not put it on a display stand. They built a simple, human-shaped form from wood and stood it in the center of the bay. Piece by piece, they began to dress the wooden form. First the padded gambeson, then the leather leggings and shoes, then the steel. They started with the feet and legs, buckling the greaves and cuisses into place. Then the torso, the heavy breastplate and backplate locking together with a solid clunk. Then the arms, the shoulders, the gauntlets. Finally, they placed the helmet over the head of the form. When it was done, everyone stopped and looked. The fabricated armor still stood in the corner, shining under the lights. It looked like a piece of jewelry. It was beautiful. The armor that Jin and his team had built was different. It did not shine. The metal was a dull, dark gray like a stormy sky. The hammer marks were visible on its surface, telling the story of its creation. The black cloak hung from its shoulders, pooling slightly at its feet. The narrow eye slit of the helmet was a dark, empty line. This armor did not look like a display piece. It did not look like a historical object. It looked like it was waiting. It stood there with a heavy, silent presence. It felt dangerous. It felt alive. Director Kale stared at it for a long time. The logical part of his mind noted the inconsistencies, the slight asymmetries, the lack of polish. But another deeper part of him felt something else. A cold feeling. A sense of unease. The fabricated armor was an object. This armor was a presence. It is formidable, Kale said, choosing his word with care. It is honest, Jin replied. He was standing next to the director, looking at their creation. His clothes were dirty and his hands were covered in small burns and cuts. But he stood tall. It is now what it was meant to be. A shell for a warrior, a second skin of steel. The task was to recreate the ancient armor, Kale said, turning to leave. You have certainly done that. The form is complete, but the project requires a final demonstration, a functional test. We must see it worn. We must see it move. After Kale left, the bay was quiet except for the crackle of the dying forge. Mira walked over to stand beside Jin. He still doesn't get it, she whispered, looking at the dark, silent form of the armor. He will, Jin said, his voice low and certain. When they see a man inside it, when they see it stop being metal and start being a man, then they will understand. Then they will be afraid. He looked at the helmet's empty eye slit. Then they will learn what it meant when a human decided to put this on and walk towards another human, with the intention of ending a life. The armor is just the beginning. The real lesson is the will of the person inside. The request for a functional test sent a ripple through the human team. Building the armor was one thing. Showing what it could do was another. It was not a question of strength or movement. It was a question of spirit. The armor needed a wearer who understood its purpose, not just its function. Mira made the call. She contacted a military attachment stationed on a different part of the Nexus. She asked for a specific person. A day later he arrived. His name was Tay. He was a soldier. He was not tall, but he was built solidly, like a tree trunk. His hair was cut short. His face was calm and his eyes were quiet, but saw everything. He did not speak much. When he entered the workshop bay, he nodded to Mira and then his eyes found Jin. He gave a slow, respectful bow of his head. Jin returned it. No words were needed. Tay's gaze then moved to the armor. He did not look at the shiny, fabricated version in the corner. His eyes locked onto the dark, hammer-marked suit standing in the center of the room. He walked towards it slowly. He did not circle it like a curious scientist. He stood before it as if meeting another person. He looked at the dull gray steel, the black cloak, the narrow eye slit. He understood. Director Kale and a few other union officials arrived for the demonstration. They stood near the entrance, a cluster of sleek figures in a room of ancient smells and tools. The subject is here, Kale stated. Proceed with the mobility test. Jin looked at Tay. Are you ready? Tay simply nodded. He walked to a table where the pieces of the armor were laid out in the order they would be put on. The padded gambeson was first. He pulled it over his head. It was thick and made his shoulders look broader. The simple clothes he wore underneath disappeared. He was already starting to look less like a man and more like a figure from a history book. Next came the leg armor. He sat on a low stool and buckled the steel plates to his shins and thighs. The sound of the leather straps tightening was sharp in the quiet room. He stood up and the metal clinked softly with his movement. Then the shoes. They were made of steel plates over leather. He stepped into them and secured them. His footsteps now had weight. They made a solid sound on the floor. The torso was next. The breastplate and backplate were heavy. Jin and another artisan lifted them and placed them on Tai's front and back. They locked them together at the sides with strong metal pins. The sound was a deep final clunk. Tai's chest was now a wall of dark steel. He took a deep breath and the armor expanded slightly with the movement.